The locksmith finished at 9:14 inches the morning. I know the exact time because I was sitting in my truck across the street, watching him do it, and I looked at the clock on the dashboard 3 times like I couldn't make myself believe what I was seeing. My son had hired someone to change the locks on the house I built with my own hands in 1987. I was 67 years old, parked outside my own home, and I couldn't get in. I want to tell you how we got there, because it didn't start that morning. It started long before that. Maybe it started the day my wife Margaret and I decided that loving our son meant never letting him fall. My name is Harold. I spent 31 years building a commercial landscaping company from nothing. I mean, nothing. I started with a used truck, 2 mowers I bought at an auction, and a list of 12 clients I had talked into giving me a chance. Margaret handled the books from our kitchen table for the first 4 years, while our son Daniel was still in diapers. We ate a lot of spaghetti in those years. We drove cars that embarrassed us. We skipped vacations and put every spare dollar back into the business. By the time Daniel graduated high school, Kellner Grounds Management had 41 full-time employees, contracts with 3 hospital systems, a regional university, and a portfolio of commercial properties across the state. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was ours. And it was real, and when people drove past a property we maintained, they could see the care in it. Margaret was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the spring of what should have been our retirement year. She fought it for 19 months. I was with her every single day. I held her hand through the treatments, and I held her hand at the end. And when she was gone, the house felt like a building I had never been inside before in my life. Every room was wrong. Every silence was wrong. She left behind a trust, a very specific, very carefully written trust. Daniel was 34 at the time of his mother's passing. He had worked in the business for 6 years, officially as operations director, though I'll be honest with you, I had been carrying more weight than that title suggested. Daniel was capable. He was personable with clients and sharp enough with numbers, but he had a habit of letting hard decisions drift toward me, and I had a habit of making them. And we had never really corrected that pattern. His wife, Kristen, was a different matter entirely. I always felt she viewed Margaret and me the way someone views a lease they're waiting to expire. She was polite at holidays. She remembered to ask about my knee surgery. But there was something behind her eyes when she looked at me that I can only describe as impatience. A low, constant impatience. Like she was always mentally calculating how much longer she would have to do this. I noticed it more after Margaret died. The calls from Daniel got shorter. The visits became occasional. When I mentioned something about the business, he would answer in the way you answer a question from someone you plan to quietly sideline, technically responsive, but fundamentally closed. 2 weeks after we buried Margaret, Daniel and Kristen came to the house for dinner. I cooked, because cooking had become the one thing that made the hours pass. I made pot roast, Margaret's recipe, and I set the table the way she would have wanted it. I thought we were going to sit together and figure out what came next. Instead, Daniel told me he thought it was time I stepped back. He used that phrase, stepped back. He said it gently, the way you say something you've rehearsed. He said the company needed consistent leadership now, that the staff needed to see a clear decision maker, that clients responded better to a single point of contact. He said he wasn't pushing me out. He was asking me to let him lead. I told him I understood. I told him he was probably right. I told him I was proud of what he'd become. I believed most of it when I said it. What I didn't know yet was that 3 days earlier, Daniel and Kristen had already met with a real estate agent to discuss selling the house. My house. I found that out 6 weeks later from my neighbor Patsy, who had seen the agent's car in the driveway on a day I was in the city for a doctor's appointment. Patsy had lived next door for 22 years. She knew that car. She knew what it meant. I didn't say anything to Daniel. I watched and I waited, because Margaret had always told me I was too slow to anger and too quick to forgive. But in this case, I think the watching was the right move. I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with before I said a word. What I was dealing with, I learned over the following weeks, was a plan. Daniel had spoken to the company's attorney, not our longtime family lawyer, but a new one Kristen had found about the trust structure. He had inquired, according to what that attorney later told me directly, about whether there were conditions attached to his control of company assets. He had asked specifically whether there was any mechanism by which control could revert or be challenged. The attorney had told him to read the trust carefully. Daniel, apparently, had not done that. Margaret had been meticulous about that document. She spent 8 months working on it with our estate attorney, a woman named Carolyn who had known us for 15 years. Margaret never told me everything she was building into it. She said she wanted it to be clean and she didn't want me second-guessing her. I trusted her completely, so I signed what Carolyn put in front of me, and I didn't ask her to walk me through every clause. I wish I had read it more carefully. Not to change anything, to have been prepared for what was coming. The morning Daniel changed the locks, he had called me the night before. He told me he thought it would be better for everyone if I found my own place. He said the house was technically an asset of the trust now, and that as trustee he had the authority to make decisions about trust property. He said he had already identified a very nice senior living community about 20 minutes away. He said he hoped I would see this as a fresh start. I was so stunned I didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then I asked him if his mother knew what kind of man he had become. He hung up. I packed a bag that night. Not because I agreed with him, but because I needed time to think without fighting in that house. I drove to my friend Ray's place, a man I've known since we were in the same bowling league in 1994, and I slept in his guest room and I stared at the ceiling until 4 in the morning. The next day, I went back to get more of my things and found the locksmith leaving. I sat in my truck for a long time. I called Carolyn. She answered on the second ring. When I told her what had happened, there was a pause on her end that lasted just long enough for me to understand that she was not surprised. "Harold," she said, "I think it's time you read Section 7 of Margaret's trust." I didn't have a copy with me. She read it to me over the phone. I want to be careful here about how I tell this part, because even now it's difficult to hold all the feelings at once. There was grief in it for Margaret, for how much she had seen and how much she had prepared for without ever burdening me with it. There was something like awe, and there was, underneath all of it, the slow, quiet arrival of something I can only call relief. Margaret had loved Daniel. She had loved him with her whole heart, her whole life. But she had also watched him, and she had watched Kristen, and she had understood something that I had spent years trying not to see. That her son had a weak place in him, a place where love of comfort could crowd out love of people, and that he needed protection from his own worst instincts as much as anyone else did. Section 7 of the trust established what Carolyn called a conduct provision. Daniel's control of the company assets, the operating company, the equipment, the real estate holdings, the investment accounts, all of it, valued at the time of Margaret's death at approximately $4.3 million, was contingent on a single ongoing condition. He was required, in clear and specific language, to maintain my primary residence, support my reasonable living expenses, and treat me with what the document called basic dignity and respect. The trust defined violations explicitly. Removing me from my residence without my consent was the first example listed. If the conduct provision was triggered, control of all trust assets transferred immediately to a successor trustee, Carolyn herself, with instructions to hold everything in trust for my benefit for the remainder of my life, and to pass the residual to a veterans charity Margaret had supported for 20 years. Daniel would receive nothing, not $1. Carolyn had sent Daniel a certified letter that same morning. He had signed for it at 8:47 a.m. The locksmith had arrived at 9:07. He had read the letter and changed the locks anyway. I've thought about that a lot since then. What was he thinking in those 17 minutes? Did he believe he could fight it? Did Kristen convince him Carolyn was bluffing? Did he just not understand what he had done? Or did he understand and do it anyway, because he had spent so long having things go his way that he couldn't fully imagine a version of events where they didn't? Carolyn filed the trigger documentation with the court that afternoon. I went back to Ray's house. I ate leftovers from his refrigerator and I watched a baseball game I can't remember anything about. And I thought about Margaret sitting at the kitchen table in 1991 doing payroll by hand, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, our little boy asleep upstairs. 3 days later, my son called me. He called from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, he sounded like someone who had been awake for a long time. His voice had that particular flatness, that comes after the anger has burned through and left nothing behind it. He said he needed to talk to me. I said I was listening. He said Carolyn had frozen all the accounts. The company credit cards were suspended. He had gone to the office that morning and found that 2 of the senior managers, people who had been with me for over a decade, had already reached out to Carolyn directly because they had also received copies of the trust provision as part of the transition documentation. The company's main bank account required dual authorization from the trustee. Without Carolyn's signature, Daniel couldn't make payroll. Payroll was in 4 days. He said he was sorry. I asked him what exactly he was sorry for. There was a long silence. He said he had made a mistake. He said Kristen had convinced him that the trust language was a formality, that Carolyn would never actually enforce it, that I would eventually accept the arrangement. He said he had believed her because he wanted to believe her. He said he knew that wasn't an excuse. I asked him if he had sold any of my belongings while I was out of the house. Another silence. He said Kristen had donated some things to a consignment shop. He said he didn't know everything she had taken. He said he would make it right. I told him I needed to think. I hung up, and I sat with it for a while. Here is the thing nobody tells you about being betrayed by someone you love. The anger is almost easier than the sadness. The anger has energy in it. The sadness just sits in your chest like something that was poured in there and allowed to set. I thought about all the mornings I had driven that boy to school. I thought about teaching him to drive in the parking lot of a church on Sunday afternoons. I thought about the year his Little League team made the regional finals, and I left a job site early every Friday for 2 months to make sure I was in the bleachers. I thought about how proud he looked when I handed him the keys to the operations truck on his first official day and said, "This is yours now. You earned this." I thought about whether I had given him things too easily, whether Margaret and I had smoothed too much of the road and left him without the muscle you only build by pushing against resistance. I thought about the comment I had seen once on a video someone had shared with me, a stranger on the internet, who wrote that parents should let their children struggle to achieve, that the struggle itself was the gift. I had read it and thought, yes, that's right, and then gone right on making Daniel's life comfortable because it was easier, and because I loved him, and because I told myself there would be time to let him struggle later. There is no later. There is only the person you are raising right now, in the choices you make today. That's not an excuse for what he did. A grown man in his 30s is responsible for his own choices. But I'm old enough to understand that what we pour into our children doesn't disappear, it becomes them. And some of what we had poured into Daniel was the unearned certainty that things would always work out, because we had always made them work out for him. I'm not going to make that mistake again, if I'm ever lucky enough to be in the position to make it. I called Carolyn the next morning. I told her I didn't want the company destroyed. I told her I didn't want 41 families losing their paychecks because my son had made a catastrophic mistake. I told her what I wanted was to go home, to have my belongings returned or replaced, and to have Daniel understand, truly understand, in a way that would last what he had almost thrown away. Carolyn listened to all of it. Then she told me what she could and couldn't do within the trust structure. She told me she had been expecting my call. She told me that Margaret had anticipated this conversation too, and had left her with some discretion in how the provision was administered, specifically in cases where the breach was cured and the grantor me chose to accept the cure. Margaret had thought of everything. The agreement we reached took 10 days to finalize. Daniel and Kristen vacated the house. I moved back in. A full accounting was done of what had been removed, and the value of what couldn't be returned was paid out of Daniel's personal savings that turned out to be considerably smaller than I had assumed, partly because they had already spent a significant amount on new furniture and renovations they had started in the house before I came back. Daniel was permitted to remain as operations manager, not director, under a restructured arrangement with Carolyn holding trustee oversight. He draws a salary. He does not control the accounts. 2 of the senior managers I mentioned, a man named Pete, who has been with me since the early days, and a woman named Diane, who runs our hospital contracts, were given expanded roles to provide institutional stability. Kristen did not apologize to me directly. I did not expect her to. Daniel apologized. He came to the house on a Saturday morning, without Kristen, and he sat at the kitchen table where his mother used to do payroll, and he looked at his hands for a while. And then he said the thing I had been waiting to hear, not because I needed the satisfaction of it, but because I needed to know he had actually found it inside himself. He said, "I don't know how she put up with me." I asked him who he meant. He said, "Mom. She saw all of this coming and she still loved me enough to build me a way back." I didn't say anything. I got up and poured us both coffee and we sat there for a while in the kitchen, not talking, the way men who have hurt each other sometimes have to sit before the talking can begin again. I still live in the house I built in 1987. The maple in the backyard that Margaret planted the year we moved in has gotten enormous. In the fall, it turns a color I can't describe to you, somewhere between orange and copper, and I sit on the back porch and look at it and think about all the years underneath it, the arguments we had in that kitchen, the Christmases, the Sunday mornings. I am 67 years old. I manage my affairs. I have a checking account with enough in it that I will never eat a meal I don't choose to eat. I go to the office twice a week. Not because I have to, but because Pete and Diane are good people and the work is honest, and sometimes I just need to be somewhere that smells like cut grass and diesel and the particular kind of effort that built everything I have. My son calls me more now. Not enough, maybe, but more. Last month he came over and we watched a game together, and at one point he laughed at something. A real laugh. The kind he had as a kid, and it hit me somewhere deep. He is not a bad person. He is a person who nearly became one, and was stopped not by me, not by a court, but by his mother, who loved him enough to plan for his worst day years before it arrived. I think about her every time I look at that maple tree. I think she knew exactly what she was doing. She always did. If you're a parent watching this, and your children are still young, I want to say something to you directly. Something I wish someone had said to me 30 years ago. The most loving thing you can do for your child is not to remove every obstacle in their path. It is to let them build the strength to meet what is coming. Because something is always coming. Life does not stay easy because you made it easy. It only stays easy until it doesn't. And when that day arrives, what will save your child is not what you gave them, it is what you made them earn. Margaret understood that. She just waited until after she was gone to teach it. And somehow, even from wherever she is now, she was still the smartest person in the room.